Hello, listeners. Before we start, I just want to remind you you can listen to Nighttime early and ad free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime. This episode of Nighttime was originally released in May of 2019. However, it is now being remastered and re released in July 2025 on the 55th anniversary of the events you'll soon hear described.
You are listening to the Nighttime Podcast.
It doesn't seem to matter where or when you are from. Every generation seems to carry with it the weight of a tragedy that struck close to home during its youth. Perhaps it was a fatal car crash, a house fire, or a murder. From the outside, these events make headlines for a few days, stir up a wave of grief, and then quietly fade into the past. But if the lives lost are part of your world, if they sat beside you in class, or if you shared laughs, it's completely different. The memory doesn't fade. The names, the faces, and the moment you learned what happened, that stays with you. In this episode of Nighttime, we're going to hear one of those stories. Back in the summer of 1970, in the woods of northern Maine, a freight train struck and killed 3 teenage boys from Cape Breton who were said to be sleeping on the tracks. It was ruled an accident, but the more you look at the details of the case, the harder it becomes to accept at face value. To help share the bizarre story of the Cape Breton boys on the tracks is Ken Jessome, a man who grew up with 2 of the boys killed, and a man who, now over 50 years later, is still searching for answers. What's been haunting Ken all these years isn't just the tragedy itself, but the feeling that something was missed, or worse, ignored. Through a series of articles in his local newspaper, Ken Jessome has shone a light back onto what happened that day. And tonight, he's going to do the same here. In this episode of Nighttime, Ken Jessome and I will discuss the death of the 3 Cape Breton boys on the tracks, Kenny Novak, David Burrows, and Terry Burt.
My name is Ken Jessome. I was born in Sydney, Nova Scotia. I was raised in Sydney, Nova Scotia. A couple of years ago, I did a monthly column for an online publication, the Cape Breton Spectator, mostly the cultural scene. But then my last article, I decided I would write about the train incident because it always bothered me. Like everybody of that age who knew the boys, we were all kind of haunted by it.
What is your connection to these 3 young men who died back in 1970?
I knew 2 of them. 2 of them were my friends. Kenny Novak, who was my age, summer of 70, 15. We were both 15, and I knew Kenny. He was from Sydney River, a town next to ours, and for some reason he came down that year. He started hanging out with our group, going to our dance halls, and, hanging around the street corners, a bowling alley, and so on. And I didn't know him well, and it was hey, Kenny, do you have a smoke? We would bum smoke. My memory, we were always bumming smokes off each other back in that time. Terry Burt I knew much better. He was from my neighborhood, Whitney Pier in Sydney. He hung out in our large kind of amorphous group, ages 14 to 20. I was 15, he was 20, so we were not really close. But we would chat sometime. I liked him. Everybody liked him, actually.
Now, you mentioned you knew 2 of the guys personally. Mm-hmm. The third that you didn't know, over the years, what did you learn about him? What was his name? How old was he?
David Burrows was the third. He was 17 years old. And he was also from Sydney River, like Kenny Novak. I haven't learned much about David. I talked to a couple people. I was talking to a woman today who was a couple years younger than went to school, a couple years behind them. And she was saying he's a nice guy. He seemed like, and he was a good fellow. And that's all I know about David Burrows.
The story of these three young men will eventually lead us to a rural area on the American side of the Maine-New Brunswick border. So what I'd like to know is how they ended up how did this story get them there? So maybe just walk through what you've been able to put together about their activities leading up to their deaths.
Kenny Novak, Terry Burt, and another Whitney Pier boy, Sydney boy, Alan Crowley, decided to go camping at Ingonish campgrounds. And so I think they might have hitchhiked up, or they got to drive up there with a family member. But Alan Crowley is back in Sydney, and I was speaking with Alan, and I talked to him about it. I was talking to him today, and he said, you know, it was the usual thing. You first time camping, and you have those adventures, you know, putting up the tent, and not getting it right, and having cold beans for breakfast, and also having, you know, meeting other young people and swimming and just having a great time in the summer, you know, at that age. And so they were up there, and David Burrows came along, and hey, you know, hey guys, and everything, and they started hanging out together. And as Alan remembers it, David Burrows said, Let's go to the States. Let's hitchhike down to the States. And he's not sure why, Alan said. Alan said, I can't do that. I have to go back home. I got to see my girlfriend and everything. And I just can't, you know, I'm 16 years old. I can't go down to the States. And they said, fine, you know, you go back, but we're going to go. And so Alan isn't sure. Maybe it was a Tuesday or Wednesday. He went back to Sydney, and they set out around there for to hitchhike down to the United States. Now, piecing it together, Thursday evening, they crossed the border. The local police in Aroostook, where this happened, the Sheriff's Department of Aroostook, so the Sheriff, Daryl Crandall, he was speaking with the press all the time about it. He said they crossed the border illegally. I don't know if he knows. That's not clear but they crossed the border, the three of them, and we're coming up to around midnight. They were hitchhiking. And the report, now I'm going by the press, you know, what was reported. It's the closest thing I have to solid truth. A driver picked them up, and he said that, you know, they're ordinary kids, ordinary people. They looked a little tired, and drove them along Interstate 95. They were close to Holton, Maine, about 5 miles from Holton. And he let them off about 2 miles from where they ended up on the train track.
The next thing we know really is from the train drivers or the train engineer's point of view.
Yes.
And you wrote about this in your article. So maybe describe the way he recounted his experience. I believe to the press is where you borrowed from.
Yes, that's right. This was in the newspaper accounts. Of them. And there wasn't a lot in the newspapers, I'll tell you, but what was in there was fact after fact, quotation marks on facts, never questioned, but what was reported. So, and the engineer, he said they were driving along as they do every morning in that area at 7 a.m., and he was making a sharp turn. He came out of the sharp turn going 40 miles per hour about, he figured. And up ahead of him about 150 feet, he saw what was, he thought was garbage or something like that. And so he's put on the brakes. And then he said, that's sleeping bags, he thought to himself, he said. And he locked the wheels. And when he locked the wheels, I'm assuming that the horn went off. But at any rate, so we have a freight train, an engine and 19 cars with the wheels locked. And as he's coming along over to these sleeping bags, he said there was no movement as long as he looked. The engine and the 19 units went over them. It was impossible, no matter what, coming out of that curve, that he could stop.
Mm-hmm. Through your articles, it seems you got quite a bit of information on what the investigators found at the scene, because I guess it was a bit of mystery initially. So maybe why don't you describe what was found at the scene after the train went over, what initially they thought to be debris?
Yes, that's right. And that's the word the engineer used. He said, I thought it was just debris on the track at first. So the Aroostook County Sheriff Department, they arrived. There's Sheriff Daryl Crandall, and he has 2 deputy sheriffs with him. And they arrive, and what they see is 3 mangled bodies. And they don't know who these people are. There's no ID. Not one of them was carrying any ID. You know, they couldn't find any ID. What they did find was they knew they were Canadian right away, because there's canned goods, cigarette packages, and Canadian money. Under $6 between the three of them, but there's Canadian money. So these are Canadians. And then one of the sleeping bags had a name and address stitched into it. That was Terry Burt's. And from there, they were able to track down who they were. But that morning, all they had when they found the bodies was one name on a sleeping bag. And they were working from there with the Canadian police to identify them, which they did by very quickly.
They identified it to be these three boys
Yeah.
that you knew. It seems as though we'll use air quotes for investigation, happened very fast, and the law enforcement down there responding had come up with a decision pretty quickly what happened. Can you tell me what you were able to figure out about their investigation and the findings of it?
Yeah, it was an incredible thing, and it couldn't happen today because there was no investigation. 7 a.m. in the morning, the train went over the three bodies. That afternoon, the sheriff was telling everybody there was a tragic accident or something like that. So Saturday morning, it's in the papers. Freight train ran over three sleeping bodies. Freight train killed three boys. It was automatically assumed right away from the sheriff that there was no foul play. Immediately, there's no question of it, which is quite incredible because of all the many, many questions just from what, was reported at the time. You could say, well, it just doesn't make sense. There should at least be an investigation. And this is the Aroostook County Sheriff's Department. This is just the local police. He worked for Sheriff Daryl Crandall worked for the railroad. He was just elected to this being sheriff. And there's no state police involved. It's just the local police. They're not, that was a strange thing right there.
Mm-hmm. And they would have had to explain why the boys decided to camp on the train tracks. Mm-hmm. It just seems, especially in Cape Breton and Sydney, we have train tracks. So you'd be raised to know not to lay down on the train tracks.
Sure.
Did they ever offer any explanation as to why the boys would decide to camp out there?
That was... that was an interesting thing. In a way, there is no explanation. The sheriff would say, it really beats me why they would choose to, sleep on the train tracks. And he always, no matter what, why would three boys decide to sleep on the train track? And, we are from Sydney. Back then, Sydney was a steel town with trains going all the time. Traffic was always being stopped by trains. You're sitting in cars or standing there watching the trains go by. We knew people who were injured by trains. We knew people who were killed by trains. And so the story was that three boys decided to sleep on a train track. Just an amazing, hard to believe thing. So in the end, he said, well, we can only offer theories. We don't know why. And no investigation or anything. So no, you don't know why. You can see, it made me very angry. But the sheriff said, well, we hear there was rain the day before, and there was a heavy shower, according to the news reports. So we're assuming that the boys were wet and very tired. And they got to the track, and the ground next to the track on either side was damp. So they slept. They decided, we'll lie down on the track where it's assumed it's drier. And he said they didn't wake up the next morning 2 hours and 10 minutes after sunrise. That's 7 o'clock in the morning, just before 2 minutes to 7 before that train came. You're 2 hours and 10 minutes after sunrise. They still haven't awoken. So he's going to assume that they put the sleeping bags over their heads to keep, in case it rains again or something like that, to stay dry, because it wasn't raining then. So it wasn't much of an explanation, really.
Now, you make no secret through your writing that you have doubts about the official findings. What is it, aside from the fact that how unusual it would be for them to sleep on the tracks, what is it that makes this seem odd to you? Or makes it seem like there's more to the story? Yeah,
it definitely seems very odd. Three sober individuals, 15, 17, 20, from a steel town, decide to sleep on the train track for some reason. Then we have to assume that 2 hours and 10 minutes after sunrise, when the train came, they were still sound asleep. That they had sleeping on the track for that, long after sunrise. Then there is no movement. The engineer, very clear, all the reports, the sheriff himself, everybody knows that they did not see any movement. So that train is bearing down on them. The wheels locked, I'm sure the horn blowing and no movement. And again, they decided to sleep not only on the train track, but just 150 feet from a curve on the track. Then not one of them has any ID. Terry Burt drove a motorbike. Now, he wasn't a biker. He was kind of a quiet, gentle kind of person, but he drove a motorbike. He had ID, like he's 20 years old. So three of them would be odd that not one of them would have ID. Mm-hmm. Less than $6 between the three of them. Now, they just arrived in the States. Did they come down with, basically no money? That seems very strange. Another thing they mentioned, empty envelopes were at the site. And I was wondering, well, at least that's a question. What were these empty envelopes? Maybe you'd want to look into it. What was that about? So there were so many questions. And then for the sheriff to automatically rule out foul play and to have no investigation, and as far as I can make out, no state police or anything, just the local people looking at it without an investigation. A very hasty local autopsy was carried out. But this is important too. The bodies, he got those bodies back to Cape Breton as quickly as possible. The accident, the train went over the bodies on Friday. Monday, the three bodies were back in Cape Breton. They're buried on Tuesday. Mm-hmm. So that he seemed to be in a hurry to end it as quickly as possible.
Do you recall the initial reaction of your peers? Like, when you heard it was a train accident, were you suspecting there to be more to this, or did you just accept the official explanation?
Right. Well, that night we didn't really believe it. We were skeptical. We didn't think those things don't happen. It didn't happen to them, and we just thought it was some sort of sick rumor. But it was the next morning we got up and we saw it in the Cape Breton Post on page 3. Another thing that always made me angry, the press coverage. It was never on the front page. It was always on page 3. And the minimum coverage, 5 articles. But we saw it, and very quickly people, among the young people, we were saying, we think they were killed. It doesn't make sense to us, all along. But it was very interesting how it happened. I remember discussing it with a friend of mine, and the adults saying, look, you people are romanticizing. The sheriff said there was no foul play. And as soon as the final autopsy came in, I have an article here, the coverage in the Cape Breton Post, the headline, foul play ruled out. There it is, black and white. It's in the paper. The sheriff said it. Why do you want to romanticize? And I remember feeling cowed at the time. And, I'm being a romanticizing adolescent, Mm-hmm. And we shut up. And that's another thing that always bothered me about it. We did nothing.
Mm. Has anyone ever put forward theories as to what they believe may have happened? Like, were you ever presented with theories as to anything outside of the official explanation? And if so, what are the rumors?
Yeah, a lot of rumors. Again, the first assumption that was common was that the sheriff went down there. He looked around. They had long hair. This is 1970. Some people, younger people, won't realize that at the time there's this idea of hippies. And hippies, on the front page, Charles Manson was on, murder. They were hippies. They were having orgies at Woodstock. They were traitors to the cause. There was a war going on in Vietnam, an American war, and people were protesting on the street, long-haired people. There was a hatred of hippies. And if you had long hair, you were a hippie. It was just a fashion for us young people. But, and it would be hard for young people to understand the prejudice against long hair, at the time. So these are 3 boys. They all had long or longish hair. Some people felt at the time, the sheriff looked at that and they said, there's 3 hippies, and they're not even our hippies. They're Canadian hippies. Ship them back. Get them back there. Well, who knows what was going on? We thought in his mind, was there a drug deal? Was there somebody bikers kicked them around? Those were rumors that were going around. But he wanted not to waste any time on Canadian hippies. That's one possibility we always thought if that happened. And I certainly don't think that there was a drug deal. I'd be very surprised, but that was a thought. Like, you meet up with somebody, we can get you a couple pounds of weed, you can sell that at a nice price back there. They ran into some bikers. I mean, there's another thing about how they crossed the border that's very mysterious. And the Border Patrol, there was a rumor that the Border Patrol was looking for them. Now, my understanding is the Border Patrol said we don't nothing about it. We didn't know anything about it. But that's one thing I would like to look in, was the Border Patrol looking for them. There is that rumor going around. And where they were killed, there's a clearing right where they were on the interstate. The only place along that stretch where you could drive in is at this location, because there's a little clearing there. And somebody showed me on Google Maps. But I mean, again, this is a rumor, because back then, what was it like? I'm going to look into that. But then you have the possibility that somebody was there waiting for them as they walked down the track. Or it could have been, some people passing around a bottle, or whatever. There's some hippies, and things got out of control. All that speculation has been going on, and I want to see, if I can find out, something concrete as I continue with these articles.
Now, with this story, I'm sure a lot of your peers and people who, from Cape Breton at the time would know this story. But as time passed, it seemingly just, for the most part, had been forgotten. But now that you're telling the story through these articles again, I'm assuming people are coming out of the woodwork to talk to you. Like, what has kind of been the reaction from people hearing this story for the first time, or for the first time in a long time? And are you hearing from people close to the story that are giving you new information?
The reaction is, when people who know the story and didn't know the story, yes, it's, it comes back, it refreshes people how outrageous the whole thing was, that this could happen, that 3 people could die under such mysterious circumstances and no investigation, no questioning, so quickly forgotten. Everybody agrees with that. People tell me their memories, and, a lot of people just remember, how much they liked, for example, Terry, and how much they, because and Kenny, both of the ones I know. So, and as they say, there's a lot of rumors, but somebody gave me, here's a couple names, here's somebody who saw them that night and spoke to them at an ice cream parlor. Well, I'm going to try to track that person down, and a couple leads like that, but I don't have anything concrete whatsoever.
I guess it's hard with the amount of time that's passed, and given the fact that it didn't get major press attention, so much of the record is word of mouth, so it makes your job harder. What is kind of the next piece of information you need to get that will allow you to take further steps in understanding and telling this story?
Well, I would really like to speak to some people who spoke with them once they crossed the border. That's the biggest thing. There wasn't an investigation, so there might be deputy sheriff still around, or somebody who's on the force. Anybody who has any contact with the situation or the story at the time, or had heard something from that time, or people who were there. That's what I'm looking for right now.
I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of Nighttime. If anyone listening has any information about the deaths of Kenny Novak, David Burrows, and Terry Burt, I urge you to contact the Aroostook County Sheriff's Office at 207-532-3471. Now, with that said, I'm going to start wrapping up this episode, but before we part here, I have some thanks. First, a big thanks to Ken Jessome for sharing an evening with me and with you, the listeners of Nighttime. A big thanks to Monty Data, who contributes the music for this show, and Linz from the Dystopian Simulation podcast, who provides my intro and outro voiceovers. But then lastly, but most importantly, a massive thank you goes out to each and every one of you listening to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to Nighttime's premium feed. Sarah, Jory, and Barb, we appreciate you. For anyone else out there who'd like to support the show, you can help us out here in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple bucks a month, and that money will fund the creation of new episodes of the show. But the premium feed will also give you those episodes 2 days early, give them to you ad-free, and give you access to a back catalog of episodes. That sounds like something you're interested in. You can go premium at nighttimepodcast.com/subscribe. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support this show by sharing the episodes on social media and letting all your like-minded friends know why they should listen. Your support is very much appreciated. Now, until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte.